Please turn them to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. That's where we're going to be taking our message this morning. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Always such a pleasure to come back here to East Side. I think the word nostalgia might be one that fits. As I think about the congregation here, I think that there's some things that don't change and some things that do change. Some things that do change, the people. I guess when I was here 40, I know I sound like an old fogey talking this way, 43 years ago, I says when we left, that there were so many people now who are gone. People of the generation in front of me, I think of Carl Betty Hudson just recently, and even people of my generation. Of course, I think of Randy Hudson and Roger Andrews. But as one generation moves on, there's others that come and take their place. And that's the thing, I guess, that thrills me the most. I know that those of the older generation have gone on or with the Lord, and the new generation coming up is encouraging. There's one thing that's the polar opposite of the way things were in 1973 when I left. So you're getting a little bit of idea of my age here. But the polar opposite, the clump of young people is here. Then the clump of young people was way back there. And I think there's some other ways in which the clump of young people might be a polar opposite now of what it was back then. And that is a good thing. It says something for the leadership of this congregation. It says something as well for the parents here. May God help us to keep on growing. I'm really glad that you got my buddy Jerry Falk to come. Jerry's very special to me, and I want him to be special to you. And I know that after this week, he will be. Before we get into our text, I want you to think of a time in your life when you have observed or maybe even experienced a tremendous amount of pain. Some of you know my wife, Beverly. She has lupus. It's thankfully under control pretty well now. But when she had a very strong lupus attack, we had to take her to the doctor, and some of the doctors said, I've never seen so much inflammation in a body. Her SED rate, which measures inflammation, was extremely high. And to see your wife writhing in pain, that's something that affects you. And of course, I think of my own dad. So many of you know that a little over a year ago, he fell and had a compound fracture of his arm. You can imagine the type of fracture that has your bone protruding from the skin. He doesn't complain, but you could see the pain. I saw him a week or so after his accident, the pain in his eyes. You are thinking of pain that you've observed. When that type of thing happens, we want one thing, and one thing alone. We want relief. And yet relief is not always instantly forthcoming. We live in a world of suffering and a world of testing. And that's where we get into the passage that I want you to look at this morning. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And I want us to begin with verses 7 and 8. And I'm having no luck with this. There it is. In the first part of chapter 12, Paul talked about some special spiritual blessings that God had given him, a vision of heaven. But then Paul said something very interesting in verses 7 and 8. And I may have a low battery or something. Probably should have tested this out before. I tell you what I made you do is just send. Is it on? It did give me the first slide, I think. Here we go. Where it says on and off, I guess. Okay, now I think we're ready to go. Yeah, there we are. Verse 7. Because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, for this reason, to keep me from exalting myself, there was given me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan, to torment me, to keep me from exalting myself. Concerning this, I implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave me. What's the question we always have when we read this passage? What was Paul's thorn in the flesh? And you and I know that it doesn't say what his thorn was. Now, there was a lot of speculation. It looks like when you read the book of Galatians that Paul had some problems with his eyes. And chapter 4, verse 15, he said, you were willing to pluck out your own eyes and give them to me. Well, why would he have said that if he hadn't had problems with his own? And in chapter 6 of verse 11, he talks about writing with large letters. I think I'm sympathizing a little more with that. When do you have to write with large letters? When you can't see what you're writing. Now, who knows if that's what he had in mind here when he said, when he's talking about his thorn in the flesh. And of course, there are dozens of other suggestions. Some say that maybe Paul was a stutterer. He said he came not with excellency of speech. That may be stretching it a bit. Others talk about stomach problems, malaria, maybe personal problems with his family, maybe nightmares from his days as a persecutor. Might Paul have had something like post-traumatic stress disorder? It's hard to imagine what it would be like to see someone stoned to death and hear the rocks crunching against his bones and them breaking. You've observed that, and you come to realize that that person who you helped to stone to death was a godly person, a God-fearing person. Maybe something like that was what he had in mind when he was talking about his thorn in the flesh. We don't know. Some things we do know. It bothered Paul. It affected him a long time, and he could not get rid of it. Now, God loved the Apostle Paul. How is he going to respond to this cry of pain about this thorn in the flesh? So that's where we get to verse 9. He said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. The two parts of that verse are going to be the body of our lesson this morning. My grace is sufficient for you. That's going to be the first part. For power is perfected in weakness. Let's go to the first part. My grace is sufficient for you. Why is God's grace, his unmerited favor, sufficient even in the trials of life? The word grace in the scripture is always associated with superlatives. You never read in the Bible about a little bit of grace. You never read about poor grace. It's always big. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 17. We're not going to look closely at these verses, just point out a few phrases from them. The riches of his grace, which he lavished on us. That's nothing little about that. 1 Timothy 1:14, the grace overflowed. It was more than abundant. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 8 and 14, made the grace abound, surpassing grace. These latter two verses have to do with what God's grace was doing through other people. When we think of God's grace, we usually think of salvation, and we should. The passage we can all quote, Ephesians 2:8, for by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of your own doing, it is the gift of God. God's grace saves us, but it even goes beyond that. He not only saves us, he approves of us. Every once in a while in New York City, you'll have a drunk who falls on the subway tracks, and some good Samaritan will jump down on the subway tracks, risking his own life to pull the inebriated person back to safety. Well, there's some grace involved there in saving the drunk's life, but do you ever look upon the drunk with favor? You say, well, I'm glad somebody was good to him, even though he was drunk. But God's grace not only saves us, he looks upon us with favor and approval. Now, that's not because of what we've done, but because of the blood of Christ. Here are some interesting verses. James 1, verse 18. Does God's grace just save us? James 1 verse 18, in the exercise of his will, he brought us forth by the word of truth so that we would be a kind of first fruits among his creatures. First fruits, special privileges, place of high honor. God looks upon us as his first fruits. Another passage, John chapter 17 and verse 6. Jesus prays first in John 17, 1 through 5 for himself. Then he begins to pray for the disciples. And at the very end of verse 6, he says something that to me is amazing. He says, they, speaking of those weak disciples, they have kept your word. Wait a minute, Jesus, we might ask. How could you say those disciples have kept your words? These are the fellows that wanted fire to come down and destroy a Samaritan village. This is the fellow Peter who slipped beneath the waves. These are the same fellows you've said, oh, you of little faith. Same fellows. And what does Jesus say? They have kept your word. How could that be? Just a little bit of grace? A dab here? We're talking about God's overwhelming grace, not just to save them, but to look upon them with approval. We want other people to appreciate our efforts. If we play basketball, we like the coach to say, hey, good play. I may have heard that once. After the sermon, we like some people, it's kind of a custom, the preachers in the back, and some people are polite. Nice sermon. And they go on their way to eat their fried chicken. Well, that's still appreciated. It's a little bit routine, maybe. That's good. But sometimes people say now don't get any ideas from this and think you're obligated to go out and talk about the sermon after this is over. But some people will go out and say, that lesson, that meant a lot to me. Well, that means a little more. It kind of goes beyond the routine. Sometimes a fellow preacher who knows what it's like to work really hard to get up a lesson says that was a good lesson. Well, that means even more. But there's nothing much like when your father comes and says, Gardner, that was a good lesson. Now, that's about as good as it gets. But there's something that's even better. Nothing can compare to the creator of the universe saying, Gardner, I approve. I approve. I am with you. That's grace. That's marvelous grace. And on the final day, when we stand before the Creator, this is a little bit symbolic, I understand. But when we hear the voice of our older brother, as it were, Jesus say, Father, Gardner Hall, that fellow right there, he's with me. He's one of my flock. He's mine. At that point, all the challenges of life, all the illnesses, and all the tears, and all the abuse, and all the mistakes we've made, and the messes we've got ourselves in, at that moment, it'll be nothing. The only thing that will matter then will not be how much money we made, not how much education we received, not how much some men approved of us. The only thing that will be in matter in that time will be that the Son of God says that he knows us and that we are recipients of that marvelous grace. God's grace is sufficient for us in spite of all the trials and hassles that we have to go through. Here's a sad thing, that in our materialistic world, that the grace of God is not the priority. God's grace is not sufficient for many people. I don't know how many of you have heard of the prosperity gospel. The idea that God wants you to be rich. He wants you to have a lot of money. There's a preacher named Creflo Dollar. I have a hard time believing that's his real name. But he said, and maybe some of you have heard of it, he said, some people come to me and say, I came here to seek peace and not money. I tell them, You need money or you're not going to have peace. Some people say that it all has to do with peace and love. No, it has to do with money. These are preachers. Joel Osteen said, if you are struggling economically, you don't have victory. What about Jesus? Didn't have a place to lay his head. Are you going to tell me that he did not have victory? I think we've got some twisted concepts of what it means to have it. You have money, have money. That's what it's all about, have money. What about having God's grace? Many of you may have heard also of the gospel of health. One of the fastest growing groups in Latin America, their name is Stop Suffering. There's one of their buildings there. That's the title of the church. You know, we talk about what are we going to name the church? That's the name of that church. Stop Suffering. The fact of the matter is God does not promise us economic prosperity. He doesn't promise that we're going to stop suffering or physical healing. I think sometimes some texts are quoted out of context to say that he promises physical healing and so forth. And we need to be careful with saying things that might sound like testimonies that we really don't know about. I know that God healed me of this cancer. And sometimes we can come across as a little bit proud and a little arrogant because as we're saying that, here's somebody who's just lost their spouse to cancer. Or maybe I know that God does this. I know God, I remember a woman in one congregation had cancer and it appeared that it had gone. God has healed her. Just a few months later, she was dead. We have to be careful with the way we talk and the way that we come across. What do we need to go back to and think about when people talk about material prosperity, an obsession with physical health, an obsession with physical healing? What's the solution? To remember, my grace is sufficient for you. Do we really believe it? Are we satisfied with God's grace? It's just hard for us sometimes, isn't it? And sometimes we emphasize this point. Isn't there a little more to this than God's grace? And when we talk that way, we're showing our immaturity. We're showing our carnality. Let's not be that way. Let's be like the Apostle Paul in his thorn in the flesh. Accepting. Okay, I've got a thorn, but I've got God's grace. It's sufficient for me. When I am weak physically, then I am strong. And that gets us to our next point. The second part of the verse. God's power is perfected in weakness. Now, how is that so in Paul's life? Well, he says right here in chapter 12, to keep me from being exalted. That can be a problem for preachers. Sometimes it's the eloquent preachers, the smartest preachers who fall the hardest. And yet these thorns, and they don't come directly from God. We're in some deep waters here. We're going to talk a little bit more about this tomorrow night maybe. Paul said, a messenger of Satan. He didn't attribute it to God, but to Satan. But God allows them because he knows they can help us. In Paul's case, it helped him to be humble and not to exalt himself too much. It also helped Paul to put more trust in God. And that's the message I think he's giving us in the last part of verse 9 and in verse 10. Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Verse 10, he says, therefore I am well content with weaknesses, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Think about that last phrase. When I am weak, physically, probably what he means. Then I am strong spiritually. Isn't that true? When things are going pretty well for us, economically, maybe our health is good, we tend to start trusting in ourselves. When those painful thorns come upon us, we cry out to God. We know He's the only hope that we have. When do we pray more fervently? Isn't it often when we're just going through those trials and difficulties? When do we dedicate ourselves more to help other people? Maybe we need more help ourselves. We learn by suffering that, yes, God's grace is sufficient for us, and that makes us strong. Examples. Isn't it true that sometimes the deepest spiritual people we know are those who suffer more than anyone else? I think I've mentioned this before here, and I'll just mention him again. I just can't help but think of my childhood, and childhood memories are so strong. I forget who I was running around with 2 weeks ago, but I remember a lot of things that happened here 40 years ago. And I'm thinking of Billy Crafts. They'd pull him right in the side door. There Billy would be. Most of you probably don't know Billy now. Completely broken body. Paralyzed from his neck down. He could just move his eyes. He could just move his arms. That was it. And it was a painful paralysis. Rheumatoid arthritis. And yet he had a depth to him. A depth that a lot of us just don't attain. And those of you who are old and remember Billy know what I'm talking about. Because some of that depth be attributed to the fact that he could not trust in anything physical. His only trust was in God. When he was weak, what was he? Strong. And there's another man I'm thinking about that you know well. You've had him for a lot of meetings. David Hartzell. Someone told me, and I don't know David that well, but this is just what someone told me, that after they discovered his brain tumor, and he had that period of a few years where he was still able to preach effectively, that his sermons post-brain tumor were much deeper than the ones pre-brain tumor. It's probably that thorn helped him to trust God more. Sometimes you just don't become very powerful until you become weak. About 10 years ago, time flies, doesn't it? I was getting a medical test, and I noticed all the nurses kind of whispering and looking up at the heart monitor. You know, it's a rather disconcerting feeling when you see something like that happen. Well, the doctor came and says, "You need to see a cardiologist." That was rather disconcerting as well. Well, I went to the cardiologist, and he said, "Well, you've got something that often indicates that you've had a heart attack." For any of you nurses out there, it's a left bundle branch block. For nobody else, you don't know what I'm talking about. But anyway, he said, "We're going to run you some tests." So they started running all these tests, and they gave me a stress test. And the doctor called me and said, "I could see on this stress test you have had 2 heart attacks." Well, I was having some mild chest pains. I think they became a little stronger when he told me that. He said, "We got to get you in the hospital." Well, you know, when you've heard that you've had 2 heart attacks with just some mild chest pains, I think, when's the next one going to be? How much longer do I have on this earth? And on the way to the hospital, I remember one of those beautiful snows that you get in early December in New Jersey, just stuck to all the trees. Everything was just beautiful, and it was beautiful snow. Maybe this is the last one I'll see. You know, I was thinking a whole lot more about heaven. I was thinking about 2 things. I was thinking about my family, what's going to happen with my family. But I was trying to think, well, God's going to work this out, and He's got something good prepared for me. Well, you're in there in the hospital at night waiting for they can give you that, what is it, catheterization. And here are the NFL playoffs, and somebody has the NFL playoffs on. Here these men crashing into each other. You know, usually I'd get pretty hyped up about that. But what did it mean? Well, it doesn't really matter that much. And then the Toyota commercial. And here's the Toyotas, and well, it'd be nice to have a Toyota. What does that really matter? I may be out of here. Well, to make a long story short, a few days later, they did the catheterization. Guys, well, your heart looks just fine to me. Well, why did you scare me to death? But maybe I needed that little scare. And when the doctor told me, you know, you're going to have this left bundle branch block that may not affect you very much, I had a little prayer. God, help me not to lose the perspective that I've had in these last few days. And I wonder sometimes in the last 10 years or so since that happened, how well I've kept that. I think it's helped. I think I still have some, that helped my perspective long term, and yet it is easy, isn't it? After a scare like that, to go back to your old routine and run here and run there and this project and that project and maybe a little skimpy on the prayer here because I'm in such a rush. It's easy to happen. It's good, just like I've done right now, to go back and remind myself of that. And life is short. You know, one day the doctor's going to come to me, if it's not an instant death. We don't choose how we die, do we? And he's going to give me some bad news, and it's not just going to be a scare. Gardner, here's a tumor, and it looks like it might be stage 4. Gardner, this heart's not going to make it. Or you have diabetes. We're going to have to make some drastic changes in your life. When I hear that news, and I know some of you have heard that news, maybe that's the time to say, okay, my body is weakening. My body's getting older. It's time to get strong spiritually. And maybe we need to get strong spiritually now, is the point of this message. Because it's so often the fact of the matter that when we are weak, that's when we're strong. I enjoy talking to young people. What are your plans for life? And I don't want to put down their plans when I make this point. Oh, they're all optimistic. That's great. I'm going to go to UAH, and I'm going to major in this, and I've got this. And I think when I'm going to major in that, there's some good opportunities in that field. You'll be able to support your family pretty well if you get your degree that way. And they say, yeah, and then I'm going to get married, and we can have these cute little kids that run around, and the perfect little family, and they're going to make some good grades, and they're going to like some sports, maybe not too much. We're not going to let them get out of hand with the sports, but they're going to like it a little bit, and we're going to give them some Bible study, and they're going to always be respectful and always take their parents' advice and just do what their parents think that they ought to do. And then a few years they become teenagers and they get into their 20s, and reality tends to come in on those dreams, doesn't it? And that college is tough. There's something called chemistry out there. And some of those professors are mean, and some of those professors are just unfair. And some of them are atheists, and some of them make fun of Christ. And then you want to find that companion for life. Did you know that's a complicated process? It's tough. And I think really now it's more complicated than ever for a young Christian individual to find a companion for life. And just a little side note, we need to be spending more time giving encouragement and Bible teaching and Bible principles to singles who may be singles in their 30s and 40s. They may never find a companion. There's all kinds of Bible teaching that can help them. But getting back to the point, that is a complicated matter. And maybe if you do find a spouse, maybe the husband has been damaged by pornography. There are a lot of young men who are damaged out there by it. Or maybe the wife has been damaged by materialism. Sometimes not always easy apparent to find that out. And then you have those kids, and sometimes they become rebellious in their youth. Or sometimes they have their own thorns, maybe physical thorns, maybe emotional problems. Life is not perfect. And I don't think it's wrong for young people to imagine it may be for them, but it won't be. There's going to be painful thorns. Thorns that make us squirm. Thorns that keep us up at night so that we do not sleep. And when that happens, we cry out to God. God, fix all of this. What does God say to us? You know. My grace is sufficient for you. If you stop and think about it, you realize that's right. Salvation, the creator of the universe, looking down upon us with his approval. In spite of everything else that can happen to us, that's sufficient. We can trust in God's grace, even when the tears are pouring from our eyes as we deal with our family's problems, knowing that whatever we have to go through, He looks upon us with favor. You know, isn't this the true way of God? The true way of God is not, God wants you to be rich. That's not the true way of God. The true way of God is not, God doesn't want you to have any health problems. He's going to heal you immediately. That's not the way of God. God's way is joy in the midst of pain, trust in the midst of grief. That is the true way of God. And may God help us to trust in this one fact. His grace is sufficient for me. If we can trust that with all of our hearts, we're going to have a meaningful, happy life in spite of all these thorns. But most importantly, we're going to have eternal life. But what about you? Have you accepted the grace of God? Have you obeyed the gospel? You know, if you haven't obeyed the gospel, you have nothing. You have zilch, nada. And we see all these people in the rat race of life going through their motions of getting their 4.0s, and I'm not saying anything, these things are wrong, of course. Getting their $80,000 a year job or $100,000 or whatever. It's a rat race if you don't have the grace of God. If you don't have the grace of God, you have nothing. But if you have the grace of God, you've got everything. Be there someone here this morning who would be willing to obey the gospel, Romans 6, 3 and 4, to be baptized into Christ and to walk up, to rise up from the waters of baptism, to walk in newness of life. Let us know if we can help you. And let's stand now and sing the invitation song.